Proportional Response, Book 1, Chapter 24, Part 7, School is back in session. Eldia allowed the other reporters to enter the reporter's observation booth ahead of her. The ones she'd warned earlier flashed her bright smiles and obviously appreciated the courtesy. One even shook her hand. The others managed to refrain from obviously appearing sullen. They left her the seat farthest from the door, of course, but she didn't mind. At least the one who'd sat next to that seat was one of the pleasant ones. She shook the Rooksa woman's hand and settled herself in to watch as Henry floated his platform to what had become his normal position, the right of the Prime Minister's podium, and a little below it, but a shade less below it than Kaz always set, his platform, and spoke. He read out the words to open the continuance of the general session, now with a required full quorum of the council with passion and speed. A glance around the chamber told Eldia that most of those assembled seemed to appreciate his delivery on both counts. It would have been good to have Kaz deliver this, but I think we were right in having Henry do it. He is the one who called for the session to be converted to full quorum. When Henry finished the call to order, he took a moment to sweep his gaze across the chamber, meeting the gaze of as many ambassadors as he could before he spoke.
I thank you all for answering the summons, for all of the choice that those of us in the regular session gave you, and I would like to apologize for that part of it.
He gave that big winning grin, and got some small laughs and a few grumbles, but even the grumbling sounded relatively good-natured.
You all saw the principal reason for this summons, which is to call a vote to make the next specialty quorum session called for the purpose of a vote of no confidence in Kilintar, immune to point of order token.
Henry stopped as more grumbles and dark laughter spread throughout the chamber. He looked up at the Penigra, as if daring the man to speak. The man simply looked smugly down from his perch, hands folded in front of him. Henry gave his best impudent grin and continued.
This being, however, a general session with a full quorum, there are a few items I would like for this council to consider before we get to that.
The Penigra interrupted.
I object. The purpose.
Henry didn't even have the chance to lift his hand before the Penigra's microphone had been muted.
No, Ambassador Ditara, this is a general session. You will note, from my call to order, that we are still on the same session number as we started with this morning. It just has the full quorum designator added. You know, and know well, that means this is still a general session, and anyone may bring business before the council.
Gotcha, you overstuffed throw pillow. Ditara's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward slightly. But he seemed otherwise unperturbed. He knows something is up, but doesn't realize the trouble he is in yet.
So, there are a few items I would like to put up for vote, now that we are all assembled, before we get to the matter I called you for, provided you, the generous members of this council, will permit me.
Eldia found herself holding her breath. This is the moment of truth. Henry has garnered a lot of support, and has been busily working over a lot of ambassadors today. Will they? The tally board light up instantly with several yes and no votes, with Henry just barely in the lead. He stood there quietly, making eye contact one at a time with the ambassadors who had not yet voted. As he looked at them, each seemed to shrug and lock in their vote, and a few others typically did so. More lights began to appear on the board, slowly but inexorably, and Henry seemed to be keeping his lead. Then came the flood, as votes locked in all at once. Henry got the final yes vote he needed to make his proposals, and then 2 more yes and 1 no came in, and everyone seemed to stop. Well, the ambassadors can all count at least. Further voting would simply be grandstanding for one side or the other, and I expect that everyone wants to get all of this over with and get back to their booze, or whatever. Henry bowed his head slightly for a moment.
Thank you, my fellow ambassadors. I will try to keep this moving along as quickly as...
The Penigra interjected.
I can move this along far faster, Henry.
Eldia suppressed a grunt of irritation as half the reporters sucked in air through their teeth at the insult of addressing Henry in such a familiar fashion.
I am exercising a Pinigran point of order token to end this session in its entirety. I care not what sort of games you are attempting to play with the line and the letter of the law here. and I don't wish to see anyone's time further wasted. Sir,
Ambassador Ditara made a show of hitting a few buttons on his console and nothing happened. The bird's feathers visibly ruffled and he hit the buttons again, and a frustrated noise made it through his microphone. Kaz then spoke up.
This is a general session of the Council, Ambassador Ditara, not a special session, nor a specific one. The actions you can take with those tokens of yours are coded into the system, but so are the limits on those actions, and simply forcing a general session to close in its entirety is not one of those actions. You could, of course, have prevented this session from being promoted to full chrome, but now that it has been called to order, you can't just unilaterally shut it down, not even with those tokens.
Henry gave the Pinigran a devilish look, then swept the chamber with his eyes.
The ambassador did, however, attempt to use one of his tokens, all in favor of instructing the computer to count that attempt as a use of one of his tokens.
The board lit up with every yes required, and several more besides, with only a handful of abstain, and the only no coming from the Penigra and the Sultan.
Good. The motion carries.
Henry put his chamber control display on the wall for everyone to see.
Let's see what the computers our Pinigran ambassador says about whether we can cause him to use the token.
Henry hit the appropriate buttons, referencing the vote they'd just taken, and the number of tokens held by the Penigra dropped by 1. Eldia grinned to herself and felt a collective sigh spread across the council. That bird threatened anyone who tried to change the rules on how the tokens worked. I bet he even thought he'd blocked Henry in, and his wall had no holes even a mouse could get through. Once again he underestimates humanity, and my Henry, and doesn't realize he's left cargo bay doors standing open. Henry flashed that infectious grin of his, and continued.
The first thing I would like to do is speak about something I have consulted, privately, with a great many of you on. Mostly with you telling me about incidents your people have had to deal with, Zoltan merchants, and even Zoltan military ships, are preying on the shipping, and even small colonies, of many neutral parties in this war. Humanity has tried to prevent this as we can, but I am afraid that even the combined fleets of ourselves and our allies can only be in so many places at once.
The Zoltan tried to object, predictably, and barely had his mic turned on before a vote hushed him.
I do not make this accusation lightly, of course. I am forwarding you the evidence I have now, complete with Zoltan document codes, and I invite the many of you who have shown me evidence but didn't wish to entrust it to me to share it with the council now.
Elida looked down at her official display as it pinged like a cash register at her penny per shoe sale. Henry sat down on his platform and pulled up some of the documents being sent by other ambassadors, obviously intending to allow everyone to read, or at least transfer to be read, the flood of data coming through the chamber network. After a few minutes, Henry stood and continued.
The evidence here is overwhelming. I think you will agree. The Sultans have been preying on neutral shipping in direct disregard of more legal laws than I think I need to go into at this time.
He flashed a wry grin and was answered with a smattering of dark chuckles.
Before we can move on to punishment, we need to vote on the guilt of the Zoltan. There is enough evidence here to allow a summary vote under, oh hell, you folks don't need me to quote law and line on this.
Henry pushed a few buttons, and Eldia could see the vote icons come up on nearby ambassadors' screens.
I propose we hold a vote for summary conviction on the charges of willful piracy of neutral vessels. This will, of course, lock us out from prosecuting the Zoltans on several related charges, including their violation of League statutes and illegal plunder, but it will let us issue a summary judgment. Does anyone wish to speak before we vote?
Eldia bit her lip as she saw several requests come through. Henry held up a hand.
I will allow all of you to speak if you wish, but I remind you that this is a grand session, and I have a number of additional proposals after this one.
The requests to speak slowly winked out. Those in favor of conviction want to see what else Henry has up his sleeve, and are willing to put off their own posturing to find out. Ha! As for those against, Henry gave a challenging look up the Zoltan and the Penigra. They looked at one another for a few moments, the Zoltan shrugged, and the Penigra went back to looking down his beak at Henry, with disdain so thick, Eldia didn't need her translator to interpret the body language. She sat back and enjoyed the show as the vote passed. Henry put on his best showman smile and kept going.
Now for punishment. I will remind you all that the vote of conviction carries with it an automatic official censure, but that seems to be far too little, since the Altons have proven that neither their military nor civilian ships can be trusted outside their space, and that even their ships, which are supposed to be under the auspices of the League, rather than their own nation, I propose the following.
Henry hit some buttons, and the official language for his proposal appeared on Elia's screen.
First, all ships from Zoltan space serving in the League military will receive new captains, and have at least half of their officer ratings and a third of their crew replaced by non-Zoltan League military personnel. Second, all ships flying a Zoltan flag, or with a citizen of the Zoltan Zandro Republic as captain, be confined to contested space, meaning theirs, that of their allies, or the space of their opponents in this war. This would be absolute, and the injunction would also be against traversing neutral territory in order to reach their enemies. Third, the second clause of this proposal shall be enforced by a blanket allowance that any ship found in violation of the proposal may be seized by any government or private entity which wishes to capture it. Such a vessel will then be considered property of the entity which claimed it. Fourth, the Zoltan Republic of Zandro shall pay reparations in the amounts described in the documentation of this proposal to the individuals and governments injured by the adventurism and predation of Zoltan military and civilian ships. These funds shall be deducted by a supermajority vote of this council from their funds in the accounts here in the council bank.